Hi, I'm Old Sneelock. Welcome to another episode of Old Sneelock's Workshop. It's all painted. Now let's get it mounted on there before this thing falls down and gets broken again. Well, with this painted, let's install it. A little cold out here, but I'm going to take these gloves off just so I can manipulate those screws a little easier. This boss is right directly above that bolt hole. Now, looking at this thing, I'm thinking that when they built it, they put the holes in an odd place. I mean, these holes are shifted off that direction. These holes are shifted off that direction. I had to open them up with a file to even get the thing to line up. Flat washer to make sure it bridges the hole, because that slot is almost the same size as the bolt head. Yeah, that's what it was originally. I had to straighten it up because it was drilled and then somehow or another sawed crookedly. Now I'm going to put these on there just about finger tight because I'm going to be moving this around. That means I'm going to have to adjust things as I go. Now we'll move your camera around. I'll move the camera around, get your perspective a little better. When you look at the bolt holes on the front of this thing, you see that they're off to this side, just like these two are. So it sounds to me like when they were drilling this thing, they had the fixtures wrong. They had it off center. And then, to add insult to injury, this hole originally was cast here. And they had to cut it out so that that hole was over this to this side far enough so the bearing, which goes through here, would fit and line up. So it's a comedy of errors. They make one mistake, and rather than fix it, they just make another mistake. This is the cam bolt. The head of the bolt itself is 19 millimeters. The Allen wrench to operate the Allen bolt is a 6 millimeter. Put that through there like that. Then a washer goes underneath, like so. Then this slides into that slot. I have to tighten these screws up just a little bit. And this is where it gets to be a real pain in the butt. There's very little room in there when you get the adjustment bolts on it. This bearing takes up all the space for these two fasteners. Since I can't reach in there with the box end, and the open end won't reach in there either because of the tight spacing, I have to use just the tip of the open end wrench go in there and try and tighten that down. Now remember, I'm going to have to adjust this. So every time I do this, I'm going to be fighting this little cobble job here that somebody thought was the way to go. Now hopefully that's pretty close to where I need it. And the bearing adjustment will make up the difference. Well, this is the worst kind of fit-saw wrench in the world. But it does let me tighten this up. It's an alligator wrench. Its only advantage is you can put almost anything in there that's big enough to catch that jaw, and it'll grab it. So it worked on this. Not exactly what I would call an ideal situation, but working is working. Now we'll put the front bearings on. I bet you thought this was going to be a short video, didn't you? Well, I've done this before. I knew. This little cam appears to be the same depth as the bearing, but it's just slightly shorter. So when I tighten it up against that washer, it grips the inner race so that the outer race doesn't grind against the surface. And this kind of gives you an idea where I'm at. This cam gets moved until that's fairly straight. Lock it down. Now I come over to this side and I move this cam till the blade is pinched between the two ball bearings. That seems a little tight. Yep. Okay, let's plug it in and see if it runs. That bearing's not turning. I think it's running up against that upper bearing. I'm going to bring it down so it tightens up towards the bottom. Square. Wonderful. Tractor Supply screws, because these have been retapped to 1/4-20s. So I was able to just go down to the hardware store and buy new screws, which is an amazing thing. Now, there are metric sizes, and most hardware stores have a selection of metric fasteners. Not a great one, but a selection. Those are going to need to be sanded down. The head's just a little pronounced. Or maybe I can just take a countersink and run that down a little bit. That might be better. Okay, yeah, that'll definitely interfere with anything I try and cut on there. And what better piece to test the saw on than what I was originally intending to cut when this whole mess started. So we'll give it a little dab of industrial spray. And start sawing. Well, look at that. We got it. Not a perfect cut, but darn close. Definitely good enough to do what I needed to do. Now to think that, I don't know, I'd have to look at the clock to see exactly how long it took to cut through this. Maybe a minute. It took a month and a half to get to. Yeah. Always use two hands when you're moving your saw. Always have your saw in the lowered position. And that's my tips for today. Oh, and when you paint this thing, make sure that the hinge is flipped up so that the paint gets there. I'm going to have to touch that up. Every time I raise or lower this saw, I have to think to myself to grab a hold of this chrome handle. Because if I reach in underneath here, I'm going to hit my fingers against the blade or catch them in the rollers or cause some other kind of damage. And every time I put myself in the position that I have to think about something, there's the opportunity for me to make a mistake. So I want to avoid that whenever possible. So it makes perfect sense to put a guard over this. Even though I don't necessarily like the idea of guards. Guards are a pain in the neck, they're in the way, they're constantly causing problems. But it makes it so that you don't have to think about protecting yourself. Because when you put yourself in that kind of position, the first mistake you make is going to be permanent. The cutoff saw is done. And I have the piece cut to make the die holder. This is going to be handy for a lot of things. I might make one or two of these because I have different size dies. And it'd be nice to be able to put them in the tailstock of the lathe. Mostly for threading small shafts. Because 1/4-20 on down, it's kind of tough to single point it. The steel is so thin that you put pressure on it enough to cut threads in it, it tends to warp. So the idea is make this die holder so that I can just chuck them up in the lathe in the 3-jaw, put this in the tailstock in a standard Jacobs chuck. I'm going to turn down a shank on the end of this thing about a 1/2 inch long just so it grips in the chuck jaws well. Then I'm going to bore out the front face to handle the small left-handed thread die that I have for making the 1/4-20 left-hand thread for the linkages on the grinder. Yeah, this is convoluted, isn't it? Making work, making tools to make tools to make tools to make tools. That's what I do. If you have any suggestions for a new video, questions about today's video, or any of the other videos on the channel, just drop a note in the comments. You know I read them all. Thanks for watching. Sliding bevel just to square the blade. Works nice because this goes up against the blade and this goes up against the backer and holds everything nice and straight. 12-ounce ball peen hammer. Snap-on screwdriver because I have it. Allen metric wrenches. This is a set that I bought when I was at Denver, and half the small ones disappeared because people needed one, and rather than asking me to borrow one, they just took the whole lot and kept them, thinking that, well, they belonged to them. I bought those. Alligator wrench. I used that to adjust the bearing guides just because nothing else would fit in the spot. It's a 19 millimeter bolt, but they don't put any room in there to get a 19 millimeter wrench in. I didn't want to take my one 19 millimeter wrench and grind it down to fit. quarter 20 machine screws. I bought new replacements for the ones on the table because they were just totally screwed up. And when I was making the cut for this little devil here that was the cause of all these problems, actually it was my own mistake, it was the cause of all the problems, I rushed trying to get the job done, and whenever you rush to get the job done, it takes much longer. Then industrial spray that works really well on saw blades. I hadn't used it that way before. I've been using it for drilling and tapping, but it works really good on saw blades. It doesn't gum up the blade, and it makes it cut really well.
This video is not to be viewed by anyone under the age of 13 in the U.S. or 16 in the European Union, without the express written permission of the parents or legal guardians of the underage person. Such written permission must be on file at the local government entity in charge of enforcing the rules and regulations established by the FTC. Anyone violating these terms is admitting by default that they hold harmless the owners and operators of this channel. Any and all questions should be addressed to your local branch of the FTC.